don't think myself is good. I don't have such concrete factor.
Then the government decided to suppress.
Over the past week, torrential rains have caused havoc for life across Guyana, in mining, agriculture, education, in homes, schools, and even in the courts. We seem to have forgotten the lessons from the great floods of 2005. Entire communities in the Mahaica River have had to relocate, leaving prime farmlands abandoned because of failure to address the problems and inadequacy of the East Demerara Water Conservancy. The government of Guyana has decided, instead of fixing rather than patching the problems of the EDWC, to invest in billions of dollars in what is called the Hope Canal. Even the most optimistic among us know, however, that this does not address the issue of flooding in regions 6, 8, 9, and 10, including Blackbush and the Pomeroon, which could do so much for food security in Guyana. It is time that this matter be placed on the national agenda. Secondly, in a letter to the press on Wednesday, February 29th, Mr. Raphael Hertz and Brian Quebec of Saiti Global agreed with Raymond Gaskin that the Amila Falls Hydro Project will cost close to $2 billion, several times the Skeldon project, or any hydro project anywhere across the world, and almost the equivalent of the country's entire national debt. If this project goes ahead, it will be a disaster of catastrophic proportion if there is a failure, one from which we as a country will take decades to recover. This project has enormous technical and financial risks. We do not have the demand to absorb the entire output GPL is committed to buying from the project. There is a significant exchange rate problem arising from the purchase in US dollars and sale in Guyana dollars by GPL. The backup facilities do not match the capacity of the Mila, so Mila down, blackouts. The country will still have to rely on fossil fuel to supply electricity to significant parts of the country. Its viability justified in part on the price of fuel. For the consumer, the price of electricity is not expected to decline within the next 15 years. Indeed, Prime Minister Sam Hinds and the minister responsible for that sector warned us only this week to brace ourselves for a substantial rate increase. Amila does not address the $6 billion line loss issue. That is one of the problems which have plagued us for more than 2 decades. The government, prodded by Saiti, is encouraged to promote Amila as a showcase. What we need are solutions, not a showcase, reason, not emotions, economy, not extravagance. My name is Christopher Ram. Welcome to Plain Talk.
Now you can get all the latest products you want, electronics, fashion, furniture, from anywhere in the world with internet shopping at Aeropost through World Mall Guyana. You'll need to register with Aeropost and have a credit or debit card account. If you don't have one, come into our office and use ours for just 10% of the product cost. Call 223-3061. Select your products. Pay for them via credit card. We'll ship to Guyana and handle customs brokerage. We can also deliver if you so desire, or you can come into our office and collect. www.aeropost.com. Aeropost. Enjoy the thrill of internet shopping.
I let it fall, my heart, and as it fell, you rose to claim it. It was dark, and I was over, until you kissed my lips and you saved me. My hands, they were strong, but my knees were...
Welcome back to Plain Talk. Mr. Forbes Burnham, our country's first executive president, died some 27 years ago he was born on February 20th, 1923. His birth and death are marked by observances led by the Burnham Foundation. Today on Plain Talk, I have with me two members of the foundation, Mr. Vincent Alexander, Chairman, and Ms. Cheryl Sampson. Welcome to Plain Talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
What is the objective of this foundation?
In very crisp terms, the objective, on one hand, is to commemorate the life of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham and to memorialize his death. Really, behind that, one would want to keep his ideas alive, because there is the feeling that many of his ideas are still relevant today, and that keeping them alive would be useful to the nation, in that they'll be able to know of those ideas and even attempt to put them into practice. There is a tendency for people also to demonize Burnham, and so the foundation also has a task of de-demonizing Burnham.
How successful is the foundation in de-demonizing Burnham? When you hear Burnham Constitution, Burnham banned this, Burnham did that.
I think we are doing a good job so far. It has not been done quite regularly because we only come to fore a lot during his birth anniversary and his death anniversary. And so, you know, I think we should do a lot more programs. I know for sure that recently we started something on the television on a monthly basis, but we need to talk a little bit more about Burnham, especially when one thinks of what is happening now, and you see so many of the programs of the government aligned to what Burnham did so many years ago. He's been dead 27 years, but we are sure that he did come before his time, and those projects and programs that he thought of are now being done in a different way.
You say that it's partly to commemorate and memorialize Burnham, but surely one gets the impression, if you look at places around the country, Burnham, Linden, Roxanne, Burnham, so many things. Was he a megalomaniac?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so at all.
Why then? Why did he think it necessary to do all of that? I mean, Hoyt never did that.
Well, first of all, Hoyt served for a much shorter period. Burnham was the founder. I don't think it was Burnham himself who decided to have those things named the way they were named. And in fact, there's evidence to suggest that he did put a hold on other attempts to name things after him, so I don't think that Burnham could be
Where's that evidence?
held responsible. People who have been in government will tell you that there were instances where they wanted to have certain enterprises and to name them after Burnham and things like that, and to make announcements about Burnham's involvement, and he refused to have that.
Was it part of the sycophancy of his era then that people would want to do that kind of thing?
Well, one has to realize that Burnham was in a particular era. There was the world itself was divided to a large extent. Some of what Burnham did was more patterned off of the East than the West, and also some of what he did was patterned off of traditions, some traditions which could be related to African traditions, and so chiefdom and things like those were things that were pretty common.
Cheryl?
When you think in terms of places being named after him, we don't have too many. And when you think that he was the one who was instrumental in doing the what is now called the Chetty Jagan International Airport, when he did that airport, he could have named it LFS Burnham's Airport, but instead of that, he named it after the first people, Timeri, and he certainly had Timeri paintings and so forth there. You know, the Yumanayana. It was done by the Amerindians, and he gave it that name.
But that would have been hard for him to name after himself.
No, well, that's true. But, you know, when you think in terms of other places that could have been named after him, the Cultural Center, we should have not have named it National Cultural Center. It could have been named the Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, you know, Center or whatever it is.
Of course.
He had the nationalistic thing about him, and so he didn't want his name to be.
Of course, just as you mentioned that, that Cultural Center, you know, the Indian Fund, some of the balance is held in the Indian Fund, not the total cost, but the balance is held in the Indian Fund, were applied. So
yes.
It might have been a bit of an affront to Indians, wouldn't it?
Well, it might have been. There's so many things that are affronts that we don't mention in this country. For example, the tremendous use made of that cultural sense now by
Right
all
now.
people, and Indians in particular, the IAC and so. They should be looking back and saying we have benefited from Burnham's legacy.
That's right.
And this is one of the things that has happened in this country. There's so many things today that are the legacy of Burnham. For example, you know, funny enough and ironical, the fact that the PDP is in government under the present constitution with a minority is Burnham's legacy.
You jump in the thing, you know. You are jumping the thing, because I was going to say, was it not quite ironic
It's quite ironic.
that this Burnham's thing, this 1980 constitution, that is dubbed Burnham Constitution,
Yes.
is being used not only to put in place a minority government, but models of dictatorship and autocracy. Isn't it something of an irony?
It is an irony that, you know, the PPP could be in government in 2012 under that constitution, because we know what happened in 1964 with a different constitution. They had a minority and they could not be returned to government. But I want to pick you up on the point about the dictatorship aspect. I think we have to bear in mind that the constitution was reformed to some extent, and that the problem we are faced with very often is not just
not the superstructure, though, Mr. Alexander. The essence of the constitution, the centers of power and all
the
those things.
essence didn't change significantly, but there are some new things in the constitution that could make a difference. But we still have a situation.
Like, you mean the things like
commissions, the Procurement Commission, the Human Rights Commission, and what is happening, in fact, the Constitution is being observed in the breach. If one looks at what the Constitution provides for the local government, we have done absolutely nothing as yet to realize what the Constitution provides for.
And you feel personally about that for the work you've
yes,
done?
Certainly, for the number 8 years that I worked trying to make a difference. So that it is not only a matter of the Constitution, it's a matter of the way in which we uphold the Constitution. It's being upheld in the breach to a large extent.
Let's get back to Burnham. What would you say were his greatest strengths?
I think he was a visionary. I think the greatest strength about Burnham was that he allowed the people of Guyana to feel that there was something that they could work towards and work for. And that led to mobilization of Guyanese as a collective, as a people. A kind of mobilization we don't have today. Today we are individuals eking out in some instances a living, and some others having a luxurious life. But under Burnham, there was a kind of a dream of what Guyana and the country could be, and people saw themselves as a part of that dream. And I think that was the greatest thing about Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham.
Cheryl, you knew Mr. Burnham. What would you add about his vision?
To me, he was a people's man. He wanted us to be truly Guyanese. He wanted you to understand that we are an independent country, and as such we must be proud of ourselves. The things that he had in place in terms of the national songs that you sang with such gust and such ego made you feel proud, you know. He made you want to be part of cooperativism, cooperation, self-help, those sort of things. And I think those are some of the things that are really lacking today. He gave you that sense of being you. I recall the days when you know, the Europeans were here and you always felt inferior to them. By the time Burnham was finished preaching nationalism and telling you about what you can do for yourself, you felt, okay, we are on same par. If you cut us, we still have the same blood. So why should you be more important? And so he gave you that sense of being you, and you are a Guyanese, and you are respected wherever you went. And that is not possible today. I don't know for what reason.
Any other attributes? I mean, one of the things, and young people don't know this, though, if you go on YouTube, Burnham's eloquence.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that is in some regards unmatchable. In fact, it is not only Burnham's eloquence. I think we've lost that that level of eloquence. I mean, during Burnham's period, you had Burnham, you had the Ramphel, you had people like Irvin, you had the Martin Carters. There were a number of people who were in fact eloquent, and they were in a sense mentors for people who were growing up. You hardly find that now. In fact, I was so impressed recently whenever I listened to Professor Carrington, because he seemed to be in that mode as well, and we've lost him.
Probably that generation as well.
Probably that generation as well. But I think Burnham really did a lot to make the small man a real man. I don't think that we have done the analysis as yet to understand the ways in which Burnham made the small man a real man.
Well, tell us.
In the first instance, I think the way in which education, not just what people say about the education system, but the way in which there was almost mass university education, not only here in Guyana, but the way in which he exploited his relationship with the Cubans and the Soviet bloc, that hundreds of young people were able to go and to further their education.
Isn't it more correct to say thousands?
Well, hundreds per year.
Yes.
Indeed, thousands of young people were able to go and further their education. And in that sense, ordinary people were able to realize their own growth and their own development and a change in status. And I call that making the small man a real man. You know, when you look at the way in which he sought to use crops, and the way in which, in fact, the fishermen crops of all crops have survived on to today, providing an opportunity again for the small man, who individually could not have made it, to have the kind of facilities to make it, to become a real man. There was a lot in that sense that Burnham did that people do not recognize. And community, understanding how the collective could make a difference. There were so many projects which were done at the collective level and reduced the need for tremendous financial input, be it roads, all sorts of community projects. I remember as a schoolboy in Burnham's time attending Christ Church. If you look at that school today, Christ Church School, 2/3 of the present building was built by self-help. And there was a government policy that allowed the school children who were doing self-help to take home hampers, so there was some motivation. But the spirit of acquiring, you acquired a skill that was outside of your regular education, you were able to contribute to national development through those mechanisms, and a lot was done across this country through self-help.
Ms. Sampson, Mr. Alexander has emphasized a lot of the domestic issues about, well, the scholarship is still for Guyanese. Burnham as an internationalist.
On par with, I don't think anybody right now in Guyana can, stand up to him.
In the Caribbean.
Or in the Caribbean. I recall I had the opportunity to be at the United Nations in 1981. And it was amazing how the different blocks, the African bloc or the Asian bloc, they will come to the then permanent representative Noel Sinclair and said, Sinclair, what Burnham say on resolution so. The resolution hasn't come yet. It's out in there before it comes to the assembly. But at the same time, Burnham's input, and they are waiting. I recall one night Sinclair said to me, Samson, you have an invitation for so. I said, yes. But you don't go to those cocktails. He said, no. I said, no, you talk so much. He said, I want you to go to meet the Mexican ambassador and the Yugoslavian ambassador. Those are the two people who are behind resolution, whatever it was coming. I went to the cocktail. I didn't even know who the people were, but I was able to find them, and they were in conversation in the time. I went in and I said, good evening, and I'm from Guyana. I said, oh, Forbes Burnham. And they actually said to me what was the reason why they were behind this. That was my mission to that cocktail reception. And I went back to Sinclair and I said, this is what they said. That is what, at 11 o'clock in the night. He said, thank you, because 4 o'clock in the morning, he's going to call me to find out what is the position. Burnham was known internationally, and people from different walks of life looked to Guyana for the sort of a lead. I recall the Caribbean bloc. I worked in something called the Third Committee. And if I did not get to Third Committee early enough to speak with my Caribbean sisters or brothers, They will not, and we have to vote on something, they will not do anything until Guyana has put a button. When we push the button, if we say yes or we abstain, they do exactly the same. And then they come to you afterwards and they say, why did you do it? Because we have to go back to our representatives and say, this is the reason why we did. So Burnham had that standing throughout. Non-alignment, you name it. That's why he could have been known as the Caribbean man.
But domestically, and there's still a number of people, you talk about the demonization, but a number of people believe, and even after they've read Burnham's speeches or read about Burnham's speeches, said he was Afrocentric, if not racist, pushing the African line, the cooperatives, lots of the initiatives were geared towards the upliftment, justifiable or otherwise, that's not the point, towards the upliftment of African Guyanese.
Burnham was definitely not racist. Burnham recognized that Guyana was a country of 6 peoples, and his policy was to give those 6 peoples an equal opportunity. And I'm speaking here from personal experience, where I might have been on the other side of Burnham on some issues. Let's take, for example, in 1978, the young people, the YSM at that time and the PYO came together to form a committee to attend the 11th World Festival of Youth and Students in Havana, Cuba. And each delegation was given a quota, and I was responsible for the YSM's delegation. And when I went to Burnham with the list, he said, this list does not represent the Guyanese population. You ensure that your delegates are representative of the Guyanese population. And he made it a mandate.
And that's personal experience.
Personal experience. He made it a mandate of the YSM group, not the national delegation, which comprised the PYO and the YSM. In fact, when you looked at the PYO, they had a minuscule number of African Guyanese who were in their delegation. But Burnham insisted that we must have a delegation that represented across the board the Guyanese people. When you look at the scholarships to Eastern Europe, it was very, very representative of the Guyanese population. So Burnham could hardly be accused, if one does the research, of being racist in that regard. I would agree that Burnham was influenced to some extent by what was happening in Africa at the time. This whole process of decolonization, one could have looked to India on one hand, and Burnham was pretty close to India. Well, he had a very good relationship with Mrs. Gandhi. One could have looked to India, and one could have looked to Africa. And I would agree that in some regards, Burnham took some things from what was happening in Tanzania and what was happening in Guinea. I think those were the 2 countries in terms of the whole cooperative movement, the whole system of local democracy.
The one-party state?
The one-party state was pretty common as well, but we didn't have a one-party state. We had paramountcy. And people seem to forget this paramountcy was a debate that was ongoing. And very often Burnham equated the paramountcy to the rule of the ruling party in England. So he didn't necessarily equate paramountcy to what happened in the East. He very often said, look, if you're talking about paramountcy, isn't it, in some regards, paramountcy when a party in England, the Labourites or the Conservatives, are in power, and it's their policies and their programs that prevail? Isn't it, in a sense, paramountcy of the party? Because the paramountcy really meant that the ideas were originating in the party that was the ruling party. That is what paramountcy really meant. These are the things that people call paramountcy.
I'll get back to that issue of paramountcy, but I'll bring Ms. Amson in on this allegation or suspicion that Burnham may have been Afrocentric.
I wouldn't agree with that. And like Vincent, I have known that whatever delegation left this country to go overseas, whether you're going with Burnham or you're going with which other minister was leading it, always represented the Guyana scene. different races. I recall, as I told you, I went to the United Nations, and on that delegation we had Amerindians, we had Indians, you had Africans, you even had Portuguese mix. So it was representative of who Guyanese were. So there was no sense, even in the women's arm of the party, if you put up a delegation to go any place, you had to make certain you had it right, the composition was right. So it was wrong to call him a racist. He made certain that people were there representing Guyana, and Guyana was not only Africans.
Because I think one should also note that Burnham always sought in his government, and even his party, to have Indian representation. He might not have had the mass of Indians, but to have Indian representation, people who he thought could effectively represent Indian interests and Indian views. And very often when Burnham had to make decisions, he consulted with those people, so that in fact his final decision was reflective of the national interest rather than just Burnham singularly. And that's one of the strengths of Burnham people don't recognize. The extent to which, when Burnham was making decisions, he consulted with people across the board before he made those decisions. And that is a critical element of a democracy. You know, Burnham is accused of not being democratic, but that is a critical element of a democracy that Burnham, probably informally, embraced, and was always informed by tremendous consultations before he made decisions.
We've spoken to some length about his strengths. What about his weaknesses?
Burnham did, in fact, have weaknesses. I think that, in my own view, that Burnham, in some regards, gave ascendancy to politics, sometimes over economics, and that may have been one of his weaknesses. I think he followed the pattern of Kwame Nkrumah, who said that one should seek first a political kingdom and all other things shall follow. I think Burnham, in some regards, gave ascendancy to politics, and sometimes his economic ideas and economic programs suffered on that altar.
I am not too sure where I can bring to fore some of his weaknesses right away, so I'll just let that pass.
Well, let's go back to what you said, his vision: feed, clothe, and house the people. During the Burnham era, we had such a situation where people were prosecuted. Owning some flour, having some flour in your possession, was criminalized. How do you reconcile
I
this?
think, first of all, I think we have to place Burnham into periods. I don't think Burnham should be seen as Burnham from 64 to 85. There were periods.
But we are talking about one person.
Yes, but you also have to, you know. So
Sure.
if one looked at what happened between 64 and the early 70s, you're not talking about those things during that period. During that period, Ghana did pretty well, economic growth and things like that. The period you're talking about, what happened between early 70s and up to when he died. Now, I think that one of the, and I'm going to go back to the question of the mistakes, I think we made a fundamental mistake under Minister Hope. When Hope...
That was Finance and Planning.
When Hope postulated that you need not keep your reserves, that you could use your reserves up and try to create an environment for economic development. And we were trapped because that's what happened. The reserves were used up. And then suddenly the oil crisis came upon us and there were no reserves. So I think that was one of the problems we were faced with, where the reserves were. There was a miscalculation of things. And that a number of things happened out of that miscalculation. For example, when we stopped using the trains, the assumption was, look, it's much more efficient to transport by lorries and trucks. I mean, you know, the train, you have to go to a station to collect and all of that. But that was when the oil price was low, and we certainly didn't anticipate what would happen with oil. And Guyana was certainly caught, probably more than others, on its back foot by the oil crisis because of policies that we had adopted prior to the oil crisis.
So even as a visionary, he had some blind spots?
Yes, so certainly as a human being, as a visionary, he had some blind spots. And again, he himself was an economist. He was on advisement. And it was Hope more than anyone else who pushed the line of not having to have all of these reserves and stand by and invest in them. And so we invested lots of money in the attempt to build the hydro, to the extent that even today there is material available that was invested in the initial UMDA and UMRP project. The embankment road, those bridges, that's not new material. All that material was bought from the road project that Burnham had engaged in to develop the hydro power.
This feeds closer how the...
This feeds closer how.
Yes.
I am particularly going to look at the feeds part because you talked about the flour. We were, as Vincent said, we were caught and money was, the foreign exchange was not there to bring the flour when the PL480 thing failed. Now, in that case, as far as Burnham is concerned, we don't have the money to bring it, let us use what we have. And so we learned to rice flour and we turned to cassava flour. Other countries were doing rice flour and so forth. And so we used their technique and to make it possible. And there are other issues but because we were able to use what we have, today we have many of the big companies, DDL and banks, are still doing products that came out of that era. We did the fruits. We dried our own fruits. We used our own carambola or bilimbi or gooseberry. Today, DDL, the three county fruits are all local fruits. Banks DIH has a product that comes out of that.
But we're now right back where we're bringing in apple, we're bringing in grapes, we're bringing in saltfish, we're bringing in pigtail, we're bringing in everything.
We're bringing in everything, but there are still some people who are still using what we have, and we don't really have the money to do that.
On Plain Talk this evening, I'm discussing with the chairman and member of the Burnham Foundation, Mr. Alexander and Ms. Sampson, the Burnham Legacy. We'll now take an ad break.
I let it fall, my heart, and as it fell, you rose to claim it. It was dark, and I was over, until you kissed my lips, and you saved me. My hands, they were strong, but my knees were far too weak.
Welcome back to Plain Talk with representatives of the Burnham Foundation. You were
on the feed program. You know, we did local peas. We grew local peas, a lot of local peas, so you could have used that. And there was something called minica, which was used for dal and used well. You know, so it wasn't a case where you did this to affect one race. Because I know there was this propaganda that, you know, Burnham banned the flour so that the Indians couldn't get to do their roti and so different things. But we were able to use even to the rice flour to make roti. It might not have come out exactly how it was. But the fact is that you were able to use local stuff and use what was grown in Guyana so as to not bring in the foreign stuff. Made you self-reliant and you exported stuff. This lady from the GPC, Vashti Warner, did all sorts of sauces and so forth. Not so long ago, when the PPP came to government, she opened up a little business where she was doing that, but I think she fell ill and so she couldn't. But the fact of the matter is that he pushed us to use what we had, and it came out right.
It's clothes and house.
in terms of the clothing didn't go too well in terms of the cotton from Kimby and so on. Although we were able to produce, because from the length of we have the WRSM, we used that same cotton from Kimbia with the help of the Chinese, and we were able to weave bandages, bandage cloth. So it was used at the hospital. We actually had I think to fertilize it and so on. So we used some of the cotton to make the clothes for the Sonata textile mill, which was used for school uniforms and so on for children and so forth. But it didn't go as well as we wanted. In terms of housing, yes, we have had so many housing schemes, and when we did housing. And we gave you house, you had the road, water, lights and everything, because we had the self-help part of it, where people were given time off from their jobs to work on self-help communities. And at the end of it, you didn't know which house you were working on. You were paid, you were even given a food package as sort of an incentive. And at the end of it, when the houses were ready, you pushed your hand in the bag and you were able to get a house. Now when some people get house lost, they don't even know where to find it because of the bush and so forth. So, you know, Burnham pushed us to believe in ourselves so we can use our local stuff.
Mr. Alexander, I want to come back to you. You spoke in the first segment about the UK and national interest and so on. I don't think any rational person would defend Burnham's handling of elections from 1968 to 1980. Would you?
Well, I don't know if it is Burnham handling of elections.
He was the president. He was a very powerful man.
Let's
be honest about that.
Let me, for example, refer to an area where people suggest that they have the major evidence about how Burnham handled elections, and that's the work done by the guys in England, where they went in England and did some filming of people who were...
The making of a president.
Yes.
Or the making of a prime minister, yes.
One of the things that people do not admit is that the people who are employed to do registration were paid, and may, out of their own interests and exuberance, have done some things wrong in the registration process.
You know, Mr. Alexander...
Now, Burnham would not be down on the ground to be able to make any determination.
He must have known. We're not talking about one elections. You know, and I think this is part of the problem that many Guyanese have. There is this failure to accept, even if not admit, that there were serious electoral malpractices, and you, as a commissioner of GCOM, know the standards of elections.
No, but Chris, I haven't said there wasn't a malpractice in England, but I'm explaining.
And in Ghana?
How the malpractice
were there malpractices in Ghana?
I cannot speak to malpractices in Ghana. I will not speak to malpractices in Ghana.
Why
because
not?
I don't have personal knowledge. And the people who have sought to present
surely there's
information,
lots of evidence out there.
People who have sought to present information have not presented information that I can easily find credible. You know, for example, this whole question of the ballot box matters. If you compare the way in which the army dealt with those people then, and the way in which the government today deals with demonstrators in this country, then you have...
I know, but we're not talking now. We're not talking now, we're talking then. We're talking about the diversion of ballot boxes to Kampai and Ghana.
The point I want to make about this, Chris, for me, the issue in Ghana should never have been elections. And even today...
Why not? If we're talking about democracy, why not?
Even today, the issue for me is not elections. The reason why the issue is not elections is because the nature of our society, elections are not a solution to our national problem. We are involved in exercises.
So what would you do then? What would you do?
We need to have a different form of government that would be more integrative. And elections does not produce that.
So are you seriously, let's get this right. Are you advocating abolition of elections?
I'm saying even if we were to have
as we have them now?
Even if we were to have elections, it must not be for a result where it's winner take all, because it defeats the whole purpose.
But that's a very different argument now. That's
so I'm saying elections is not the issue. That's where I started. I'm saying elections is not the issue. And so for me, I have not focused so much on the elections. I would say if Burnham made a mistake, if he made a mistake, it was not the elections per se. I mean, of course, what happened there, or what was alleged to have happened there, was tremendously used against him, and is still the mark against him today. But if he made a mistake, I think that he...
You still use the subjunctive there.
You're
not accepting that this happened.
I don't have the evidence. I don't have the evidence. My position on the matter
even
of
as an academic,
the
research you've done?
My position on the matter of elections and who is right and who's wrong is that this country needs a body that will go back to the past and let everybody bear their conscience. I don't think it's fair for us to put Burnham on the spot about elections. Let us start with the Houston by-elections.
No, let's put everybody. But don't say because you don't put that one, you can't put this one.
Let us start with the Houston by-elections.
But
the country does not have PPP.
But the court adjudicated on the Houston by-election.
But it was never held.
The court adjudicated on it.
But it was never held. The by-election was never held. The point I want to make, Chris, is that there has been a serious problem in this country on the question of the political culture, and that has affected everybody. And therefore, I have a difficulty contributing to singling out Burnham and his era in that regard. And I will only engage in this discussion in the context of the malady of the nation rather than the malady of Burnham.
But we're talking about Burnham here,
we're talking about Burnham, but we're talking to a public.
Yes.
A public which is
about Burnham.
About Burnham, but in the context of Guyana. And a public which has been sold a story about Burnham being the dictator, Burnham being the rig of elections. And I'm saying that if we want to discuss that, we must discuss it in a very holistic way, where we understand that the nation, and we come to the conclusion that Guyana came to, there is no guilty race, that the nation has had a problem.
That's a different issue from elections.
It includes elections.
But it's a different issue.
Predating Burnham, and that we must all bear our souls in that matter, and that's the context in which I'll discuss this issue. I will not discuss this issue given the national situation, putting Burnham out there to be shot down, when others who have done no better. Let's go to the PPP
would you accept them? And you know,
I'm accepting.
You're a very rational and logical person. Would you accept, however, that the failure to address this problem allow whatever myths and misconceptions there may be to continue unabated?
The failure to address the problem created the basis for those who have perpetuated the myths.
So why not address them?
Right? But I'm saying, I'm going further. I'm saying, given the nature of our politics, to address them in relation to Burnham alone will not necessarily change anything. I am not convinced that if we were to go there and to say Burnham rigged elections, he admits it, that tomorrow morning the people whose minds have been poisoned are going to get up and say, we forgive him. More than that, I'm saying, there are others who have done things not dissimilar. And therefore, the context in which people are likely to say, all right, let's put this to rest, is a context in which everybody bears their soul.
You use the word forgive just now, Mr. Alexander. And I immediately thought of the Working People's Alliance, whose leader, one of its founder leaders, Walter Rodney, a great Guyanese, I think all of us accept that, is alleged to have been killed by the Burnham machinery. Is there an irony now that the Working People's Alliance is in a political alliance with the People's National Congress called the APNU?
You know, Chris, there is something called revisionism. I think that the Working People's Alliance, in retrospect, have come to a realization that Burnham was not the person whom they described him to be. And that in fact...
What makes you come to that? Because they've not said that.
They have not said it. They've not said it. But in fact, they dealt with Burnham vis the PPP. And what they've said about the PPP now, to me, is a statement also about Burnham. And they've come to realize...
What do you mean? They're saying bad things about the PPP, so
they've come to realize that they were pulled into a cul-de-sac with the PPP and made use of, rather than any genuine relationship. The PPP merely recognized that the WPA had the ability at that time to mobilize African Guyanese, and therefore it gave an aura of unity and national movement against the People's National Congress. But the PPP was not in itself sincere about that. And so the WPA were victims. They didn't quite understand the political arena in which they were operating. They were
supposed to be some of the greatest political thinkers.
They were romantic. There's a lot of romanticism that affected the WPA. The fact that
you're saying Walter Rodney, Clive Thomas, Josh Ramsamy.
There was romanticism. I'm saying that.
All that lot.
It added up to romanticism what they were doing in some regards. You know, the fact that, you know, this whole question of Walter Rodney's death, we have no evidence as yet as to who killed Walter Rodney. We have evidence as to how he died. That's a fact. He died with an instrument which he said was supposed to be a walkie-talkie, but turned out to be otherwise. Now, we don't know if he didn't know it was otherwise, but it had to be tremendous romanticism for a man like Walter Rodney to be testing a walkie-talkie. I mean, the walkie-talkie is not something new in technology. Everybody knows how a walkie-talkie works.
But you trust, there are some people that you deal with, Mr. Alexander, that you would trust implicitly and explicitly, wouldn't you?
Yes, but why you have to trust a man about a walkie-talkie? That's the point I'm making.
Do you agree, Ms. Hampson, that the WPA in its opposition to Burnham and the PNC was being romantic?
Vincent was more involved in that level of politics than I was. So the romanticism that he's talking about, I am learning. But one thing I want to say is that I was a little surprised that the leader of such an organization will be the one to be, as Vincent said, testing that.
Yeah, let's remove the one incident. Right. We're talking a general relationship issue.
He was an intellectual, and they had a bright bunch of people, and the thing out there which says that because of his intelligence he was a threat to Burnham, and so Burnham wanted to get rid of him. I don't know that. I have had very good relationship with the female section of the WPA, and I really don't. I mean, as I said, he was more involved in that level of politics.
Never forget that Burnham was in the first instance of PPP. Burnham was in the bowels of the PPP. He understood.
He was chairman, was he?
Yes. He understood the PPP. Burnham knew what he was dealing with. WPA were partners, you know, it's an external relationship. I don't think they understood what they were dealing with. And they have, in retrospect, now come to understand what they were dealing with. And one must also bear in mind that in some regards, the PNC has gone through some transformation itself.
But if
right? And therefore that transformation has also assisted in the relationship with the WPA at this time.
What kind of transformation?
First of all, I think the Hoyt era, in some regards, paid more attention to the question of governance than the previous era.
Than Burnham did.
Than Burnham did. Hoyt was very much concerned.
It undid lots of his economic policies.
That's the economic part, but I started off with the governance part.
Yes.
Because, for example, Hoyt was more concerned. You have to look at the world context too, the collapse of the East and the West and all of that, and socialism dying. And Hoyt's position.
That happened in '89, however. Burnham came in '85.
Perestroika, as we call it, and glasnost started before '89. The writings were on the wall and all of that. The Gorbachev was already in place and things were already happening. And Hoyt emphasized the separation of powers in Guyana. It was very clear that you had the parliament on one hand, a government, the executive on the other hand, and the judiciary. And that was a critical movement away from the socialist state, which does not necessarily see. Socialist state talks about the separation of functions, not the separation of powers. So it was a clear ideological issue that was involved that differentiated Hoyt from Burnham in that regard.
Time is running out on us. I hope I can get in two questions. What is the relationship between the Burnham Foundation and the People's National Congress and the APNU?
Burnham Foundation is a non-governmental, non-political organization and works with any group of people who are prepared to embrace its objectives. We have found the People's National Congress to have embraced its objectives. We have not really tested the waters with APNU per se.
Would you agree that the PNC turned its back on Burnham and Burnham's vision for several years post his death?
I can't agree with that for the simple reason that myself having been in the PNC, I have always,
as an individual perhaps?
No, using the PNC as an organization, done things to memorialize and commemorate. I would agree that the PNC, the central level, could have done more. But whenever I was in charge of Georgetown, for example, whenever I did things about, and I always did, we always had activities, the PNC had no choice but to embrace it.
And from my point of view, as part of the women's arm of the party, the National Congress of Women, we always commemorated Burnham's death anniversary. We were the first to put a bust at the headquarters of Kitty 1 year after he died. And that was the beginning of our commemoration activities, and we got involved with the party.
But is it true though, Ms. Hampson, that for several years, even your organization became fairly low-key?
Yeah, we're low-key, but at the same time, when it comes to the Burnham activity, we have had it every single year. There was not a year that we missed it.
When you hear the comment that Jagdeo is a Burnham in disguise, or undisguised, do you regard that as a compliment?
It is not. It is an incomplete comment for this reason. Jagdeo does try to mimic Burnham, but he does not have the intellectual and other capacities to be a Burnham.
The tendency to be autocratic?
The style of the man. These people who mimic Burnham, they mimic style, they don't mimic substance. So Jagdeo, for example, goes
autocracy was substance, though, wasn't it?
Jagdeo goes up to Tin and points to John and says, "I'm going to make that the university campus." It's a kind of theatrics Burnham would have been involved in.
I don't think that I can compare him with Burnham. His oratory is not there. His intellectual capacity is not there. So regardless of what he tried to do, he could never be a Burnham.
How long do you think it would take, and this is my final question, how long do you think, and we'll have to be brief, it would take for Burnham to be put in a proper context?
I don't think it's simply a matter of time. It's a matter of how this nation matures and deals with its past leaders.
Final word from you?
I would just like to say that they should look at Burnham in a different light. Those who were so much against him, read his articles, his books. I'm sure you can get them at Freedom House, at Red House, and they have it, a full collection where they're now using to implement some of his policies.
May I politely suggest that maybe that's a function
the Burnham
that the
Foundation
Burnham Foundation
also has a full collection of Burnham's works. This year we'll be putting out volume 1 of the works of Lyndon Fobb Sampson Burnham.
Ms. Cheryl Sampson, Mr. Vincent Alexander, member and chairman, respectively, of the Burnham Foundation. Thank you very much to appear on Airing and Play Talk this evening and to discuss the life and legacy of Forbes Burnham, Guyana's first executive president. Operators and viewers, thank you, good night, see you next week. I'll have Mr. Raymond Gaskin, my friend and buddy.
I let it fall.
Now you can get all the latest products you want, electronics, fashion, furniture, from anywhere in the world with internet shopping at Aeropost through World Mall Guyana. You'll need to register with Aeropost and have a credit or debit card account. If you don't have one, come into our office and use ours for just 10% of the product cost. Call 223-3061. Select your products. Pay for them via credit card. We'll ship to Guyana and handle customs brokerage. We can also deliver if you so desire, or you can come into our office and collect. www.aeropost.com. Aeropost. Enjoy the thrill of internet shopping.
I let it fall.